It all started with the most ridiculous letter I'd ever received in my life. And believe me, living under an HOA meant I'd already seen my fair share of absurd demands, ranging from lawn color compliance to the exact dimensions of acceptable welcome mats. But this one truly took the crown. The HOA was fining me for owning too much water. At first, I thought it was some kind of prank, maybe one of my neighbors pulling a joke, but no, the official letterhead, the bold block letters, and the signature of Karen, the HOA president herself, confirmed it was very real. You see, my property had a small lake, a natural spring-fed reservoir that I had inherited from my grandfather, along with a little dam he had built decades ago to control the water flow during heavy rains. It was a peaceful spot, something I cherished not only for fishing and relaxation, but also because it supplied water to some of the wildlife in the area. To me, it was part of the land, part of my heritage, part of what made my home truly mine. But to Karen and her obsessive HOA cronies, it was apparently an illegal hoarding of a natural resource, and she claimed it was a violation of community standards because it disrupted neighborhood harmony. I sat there reading the letter again and again, trying to wrap my head around how in the world anyone could even measure or define such nonsense. How exactly could one person own too much water when it was literally part of the land? But sure enough, they had itemized it. Unregistered private water reservoir, $250 fine per day until resolved. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about money. This was about power, control, and Karen's never-ending obsession with asserting dominance over everyone in the neighborhood. She hated that I had something unique, something she couldn't regulate, and in her twisted mind, she had found a way to weaponize the HOA rules against me. The irony of it all was that Karen herself was planning an elaborate garden party the very next weekend, something she had bragged about at every meeting, and she constantly boasted about her imported roses, her perfectly trimmed hedges, and the fact that she had reserved the community spotlight to highlight her backyard during the event. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got, not just at the ridiculous fine, but at the way this woman operated like some dictator of the suburbs. My grandfather had built that dam with his bare hands, and he taught me how to maintain it, how to respect the water, how to manage the flow so that the neighborhood wouldn't flood during storms. Ironically, many of these same neighbors who were now silent under Karen's rule had benefited from the reservoir's control in the past. Without it, half the homes downhill would have been underwater during last year's storms. But did Karen ever mention that? Of course not. To her, it wasn't about fairness or safety, it was about making sure she was the center of attention, the one giving orders, the one people feared crossing. I thought about ignoring the letter at first, but I knew how Karen operated. Ignoring it would only escalate her theatrics. She would tack on fines, send threatening notices, maybe even try to involve county officials by twisting the rules in her favor. I needed a way to make a point, something she couldn't ignore, something that would expose how absurd her crusade was. That's when the ideas started forming in my mind, and it came to me almost naturally as I sat by the dam one evening, watching the calm water reflect the fading sunset. The garden party. Her precious, over-the-top garden party was timed perfectly with her harassment. What better way to show her the consequences of her obsession with my water than to let her experience the power of it firsthand? I wasn't planning on destroying anything permanently, but a good, controlled release of water from the dam would flow straight down toward her property, washing across her immaculate lawn, and if timed right through the center of her little extravaganza. The thought made me chuckle at first, then laugh outright, until I was nearly doubled over, because it was poetic justice. She wanted to fine me for owning too much water? Fine. I'd share it with her and her guests in the most unforgettable way possible. But this wasn't something I could just do recklessly. I needed to plan it carefully, make sure it wasn't dangerous, only disruptive, enough to ruin her party, but not enough to damage property or harm anyone. So, over the next few days, I inspected the dam, checked the spillway, and adjusted the gate valve that controlled the release. My grandfather had taught me how to regulate the flow in case of emergencies, so I knew exactly how much water to let out and how fast to avoid causing damage. The key was timing. Karen's party was scheduled for Saturday at 4 p.m. sharp, with live music, catered food, and what she smugly called an elegant showcase for the neighborhood elite. I could already imagine the smug look on her face as she gave tours of her backyard oasis. But she had no idea that, upstream, her nemesis was preparing something that would humble her in front of everyone. The day before the event, I received another notice taped to my front door, this time warning that my unpaid fine had already reached $1,500 and further action would be taken if I did not comply. I smirked as I tore it down, crumpled it, and tossed it in the trash. She had no idea what was coming, and the anticipation made it even sweeter. Saturday arrived with the kind of flawless weather that Karen had probably prayed for: sunny skies, a light breeze, and just enough warmth to make her guests comfortable without breaking a sweat. And from the early hours of the morning, I could already hear the clinking of glasses, the buzz of hired staff setting up tables, and the faint hum of a sound system being tested in her backyard. She had spared no expense, as expected, draping white tents over her perfectly manicured lawn, setting up rows of chairs with satin covers, and arranging tall vases filled with imported lilies and roses that must have cost a fortune. The entire cul-de-sac had been commandeered for valet parking, which left the rest of the neighbors quietly grumbling, though none dared to confront her. Because Karen had that kind of presence that cowed people into silence, even when she was blatantly stepping on their toes. From my vantage point on the ridge near the dam, I had the perfect view of her backyard, albeit at a distance, but I didn't need binoculars to see the gleam of her arrogance in every extravagant detail. She wanted this party to be remembered not just by her guests, but by everyone in the neighborhood as the crowning jewel of her reign as HOA president. What she didn't know was that it was indeed going to be remembered, just not the way she intended. I had already checked the dam earlier in the morning, testing the gate valve to ensure it moved smoothly, calculating how long it would take for the water to surge down the slope toward her property, and most importantly, confirming that the volume wouldn't cause structural harm, but would definitely create a muddy, watery mess. My grandfather used to say, the dam doesn't just hold back water, it holds back consequences, and that phrase echoed in my mind as I prepped everything for the moment of release. By early afternoon, Karen's guests began arriving in droves. Men in crisp suits, women in colorful dresses and oversized hats, children dressed like they were attending a royal wedding instead of a suburban backyard bash. The air carried the scent of roasted meats, buttery pastries, and fresh fruit, and I could even hear snippets of laughter and applause whenever Karen gave one of her self-important toasts. She stood there like a queen on her throne, holding a champagne flute, gesturing proudly to her flower beds as if she had cultivated them by hand rather than paying an overpriced landscaping crew to do the work. Every part of me wanted to storm down there and shout about how ridiculous the water fine was, how she was abusing her power, but I knew words would never make an impact on someone like her. No, she needed a lesson she couldn't spin, deny, or twist into another HOA rule. That's when I positioned myself at the valve and checked my watch, 3:55 p.m. 5 minutes before the official start time, she had plastered across every HOA notice board and newsletter. I took a deep breath, my hand steady on the wheel, and slowly began turning it. At first, nothing seemed to happen, just the faint creak of old metal, then a low, rumbling gurgle as the water surged forward, trickling at first, then rushing with more force as I opened it wider. Within moments, the sound transformed into a steady roar, the water cascading down the spillway like a silver serpent, slithering its way toward the downhill slope that led directly to Karen's yard. I tightened the valve at a precise angle, ensuring it was strong enough to flood but not devastating. The anticipation made my pulse race, and I couldn't help but chuckle as I imagined Karen's perfectly lined tables sinking into soggy grass. Sure enough, about 10 minutes later, the first waves of water reached the edge of her property. From my vantage point, I saw guests suddenly lifting their shoes, confused murmurs rippling across the crowd as the ground grew damp, then muddy. Karen, at first oblivious, continued her speech near the floral archway, until someone pointed at the water creeping across her precious lawn. She spun around, her face morphing from smug satisfaction to confused disbelief, and then finally to outright horror as the trickle transformed into a steady flow, soaking the rug she had laid out, tipping over decorative lanterns, and splashing against the legs of her buffet tables. Guests began shrieking, some grabbing their plates and glasses, others stumbling as the mud swallowed their expensive shoes. The live band tried to keep playing at first, as if pretending nothing was wrong, but when the water reached their electrical equipment, they scrambled in panic, abandoning instruments and scattering into the street. Karen shouted orders like a general losing control of the battlefield, her voice shrill and frantic, yelling at the staff to block the water, yelling at guests to stay calm, yelling at no one in particular as she lifted her dress to avoid the rising mess. I laughed so hard from the ridge that tears rolled down my cheeks. It was chaos, utter glorious chaos, and the best part was that it was completely natural. I hadn't destroyed anything, I hadn't broken any laws, I had simply shared the excess water that Karen was so insistent I should own. If anyone asked, I could easily argue that I was releasing pressure from the dam to avoid flooding, which was technically true. The symbolism was perfect. She had fined me for owning water, and now she was drowning in it. Neighbors who had been too afraid to cross her before now stood on the sidewalks, some covering their mouths to hide their laughter, others openly recording the disaster on their phones. I could only imagine the videos circulating later that night. Karen's elegant showcase transformed into a mud wrestling pit. The water eventually pooled around the edges of her lawn, soaking her imported roses until their petals drooped like drowned rats, washing away the mulch and leaving muddy streaks across her once pristine patio. Guests fled in their expensive cars, honking and splashing through the street, while Karen stood alone in her soggy kingdom, screaming into her phone, no doubt calling either the HOA board or the police. I shut the valve once I saw enough damage done, content that the point had been made. I didn't need to ruin her house or her livelihood. Just her pride was enough, and by the look on her face, I had achieved exactly that. The aftermath of the flood was everything I could have hoped for and more, but it also set off a chain of events I hadn't fully anticipated, because while I sat there on the ridge savoring the sight of Karen flailing around in knee-deep mud and ruined decorations, I knew she wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly. She was going to retaliate, and she was going to do it in the loudest, most dramatic way possible. By the time I walked back to my house, dried mud on my boots from inspecting the spillway, my phone was already buzzing with notifications from a neighborhood group chat, pictures, videos, and even slow-motion clips of Karen's garden party being washed out were spreading like wildfire. The captions ranged from sarcastic to downright brutal. Guess the HOA forgot to schedule Noah's Ark, Karen's garden spa now featuring mud therapy, and my personal favorite, when life gives you too much water, share it with Karen. Some neighbors messaged me privately, half-jokingly thanking me for doing what they all wished they had the courage to do, though none of them dared to mention my name in the group chat itself. Still, I knew it was only a matter of time before Karen put the pieces together. Sure enough, barely an hour later, a sharp pounding rattled my front door. When I opened it, there she was, hair matted, makeup smeared, expensive dress stained brown from the knees down, and fury radiating off her like steam from a boiling kettle. She didn't even wait for me to speak. She shoved a mud-streaked finger in my face and shrieked, "You did this! You think you're clever? You will regret the day you messed with me." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment I almost pitied her, but then I remembered the thousands of dollars in bogus fines she had slapped on me, the smug way she ruled the HOA meetings, and the sheer arrogance of trying to charge me for owning too much water. So instead of apologizing or backing down, I leaned against the doorframe, crossed my arms, and said calmly, "Karen, I have no idea what you're talking about. If your yard flooded, maybe it's because the drainage wasn't up to code. That sounds like an HOA violation to me." The way her jaw dropped and her eyes bulged nearly made me laugh out loud, but I kept my face straight. She sputtered, trying to form words, but rage choked her into silence, and finally she stormed off, vowing loudly that she was calling the authorities. True to her word, within half an hour, 2 county inspectors and a sheriff's deputy showed up at my driveway. Karen marched beside them like some deranged prosecutor, waving her arms and pointing toward the ridge, ranting about how I had weaponized my water reservoir to destroy her property. The deputy, a tall man with a tired expression, listened patiently before walking up to me and asking if I could explain. So I calmly walked him and the inspectors up to the dam, showed them the spillway, the gate valve, and even pulled out the logbook my grandfather had kept, documenting decades of controlled releases whenever the water level grew too high. It's standard maintenance, I explained, and if I don't release pressure periodically, the entire ridge could collapse and flood half the neighborhood. What happened to Karen's lawn is unfortunate, but it was nothing more than a necessary safety measure. The inspectors nodded along, flipping through their clipboards, and one even remarked that it looked like I had done an excellent job maintaining the dam, better than most private landowners. Karen, of course, screeched objections, demanding they find me, arrest me, do something, anything, but the deputy just sighed and told her that unless she had proof I intentionally targeted her property, there was nothing criminal here. Watching her face as she realized she couldn't twist the law to her, well, this time was pure satisfaction. But Karen wasn't one to accept defeat gracefully. Over the next week, she unleashed a barrage of HOA notices at me. Citations for excessive water displacement endangering community property values, and even failure to uphold neighborhood aesthetics. Each one came with a fine attached, ranging from a few hundred to several $1,000s, clearly pulled out of thin air. It was harassment, plain and simple. Luckily, I had kept every letter, every absurd notice, and every text message she had sent, and with the growing pile of evidence, I decided it was time to fight back formally. I contacted an attorney who specialized in HOA abuse cases, and the moment I explained the situation, he practically laughed out loud. "Fining you for owning too much water? That's one for the record books," he said, shaking his head. "Don't worry, we'll handle this." Meanwhile, the neighborhood gossip mill kept spinning, and Karen's reputation, once ironclad, was crumbling fast. Videos of her shrieking in the mud circulated on social media, racking up thousands of views under captions like HOA, Queen Dethroned, and Karen versus the flood. Some of her closest allies on the board began distancing themselves, suddenly silent during meetings, unwilling to be associated with her sinking ship. It was delicious to watch, but I knew better than to underestimate her. A wounded Karen was a dangerous Karen, and she still had enough power to make my life miserable if I wasn't careful. The tipping point came when she organized an emergency HOA session to discuss my so-called violations. She plastered notices on every door, calling me a threat to the community, and stacked the meeting agenda with fabricated charges. But what she didn't know was that my lawyer had already prepared a counteroffensive. When the day of the meeting arrived, the community center was packed, half the neighborhood eager to see the showdown, the other half reluctantly dragged there out of fear of fines. Karen strutted to the podium, trying to regain her aura of control, but her voice cracked as she rattled off the list of accusations against me, her finger jabbing the air with every sentence. Then my attorney stood, calm and collected, and laid out our evidence: copies of every absurd notice, photos of the dam's logbook, expert statements on the necessity of controlled water releases, and most damning of all, proof that Karen had been using HOA funds to pay for her own garden party under the guise of community engagement. The room erupted in gasps, whispers, and even a few laughs. Karen's face turned ghostly pale, then beet red, as the board members squirmed in their seats. For once, the balance of power shifted, and she could feel it slipping through her fingers. The silence that followed the revelation about Karen's misuse of HOA funds was heavy, almost suffocating, the kind of silence where everyone in the room knows the tide has turned, but no one wants to be the first to speak. And for a moment, Karen just stood there frozen behind the podium, clutching her papers as if they might somehow shield her from the truth unraveling before her very eyes. But the murmurs from the crowd grew louder and louder until one of her own board members, a man who had always nodded along to her every command, cleared his throat and said, "Madam President, is this true?" The way Karen whipped her head toward him, eyes blazing, made it clear she was about to snap, and sure enough, She launched into a rambling tirade about how the party had been for the good of the community and that the imported flowers, the valet service, and even the champagne were morale boosters necessary to maintain neighborhood prestige. But the words fell flat because everyone had already seen the videos of her shrieking in the mud, and no amount of spin could erase the image of her. Precious roses drowning under the very water she tried to find me for owning. My lawyer seized the moment, sliding neatly into the gap she had left, pointing out how her fabricated fines and harassment against me weren't isolated incidents, but part of a pattern of abuse that went back years, citing other resident stories that had been quietly buried under threats of retaliation, and one by one, neighbors who had always stayed silent began to speak up. The retired teacher, who was fined for having her blinds the wrong shade of beige, the young couple penalized for planting a vegetable garden, the single mother harassed over her child's bicycle being left on the porch. As the testimonies piled up, Karen's iron grip on the room dissolved like sugar in hot tea, her once commanding presence reduced to a flustered woman standing knee-deep in accusations with no lifeline in sight. Finally, after nearly an hour of this, the board had no choice but to call for a vote of no confidence, and the result was swift and brutal. Karen was stripped of her title as HOA president, removed from the board entirely, and left standing alone as the community she had ruled through fear turned their backs on her. She tried to protest, tried to threaten legal action, but even the county inspector, who had quietly sat in the back of the room, stood and reminded her that misuse of HOA funds was not just a violation of trust, but potentially a criminal matter. The look on her face as the reality sank in, that her reign was over, that she might actually face charges, was sweeter than any revenge I could have orchestrated myself. I walked out of that meeting to a round of handshakes, pats on the back, and whispered thank yous from neighbors who finally felt free to breathe again. And though I didn't gloat, I couldn't help but feel a deep satisfaction knowing that my grandfather's dam, the very thing she had tried to weaponize against me, had ended up being the instrument of her downfall. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood transformed in ways I hadn't expected. The board reorganized under new leadership, this time with people who actually cared about fairness and community rather than power. The ridiculous fines were rescinded, and residents began reclaiming their individuality, porches decorated with colorful chairs, kids riding bikes without fear of citations, gardens springing up with tomatoes and peppers instead of uniform rose bushes. As for Karen, she disappeared from public view, retreating into her house with blinds drawn, her once pristine yard neglected and overgrown, a silent monument to her fall from grace. Rumors swirled that she was facing an audit, that her husband had left her, that she might even be forced to sell the house to pay off debts from her extravagant spending, but I didn't bother to dig for details. Her misery wasn't my concern anymore. My concern was the dam, the water, and the land my grandfather entrusted me, and I found myself standing there more often, watching the calm surface reflect the sky, feeling a renewed sense of peace now that I no longer had to worry about HOA letters taped to my door. Still, every time I looked downstream, I couldn't help but chuckle at the memory of that day, the sight of Karen floundering in mud, her guests scattering like startled birds, her perfect world undone by the very element she tried to claim I owned too much of. In a way, the water had been more than just a weapon of poetic justice. It had been a reminder to everyone that you can't control nature, can't bottle it up and regulate it into submission, no matter how many fines or rules you invent. You can only respect it, work with it, and understand its place in the larger picture. That was the lesson my grandfather tried to teach me, and now, thanks to Karen's arrogance, the entire neighborhood had witnessed it firsthand. Looking back, I realized something else too. Revenge hadn't really been the goal, even though it felt good in the moment. What I truly wanted was freedom, freedom from her tyranny, from the endless nitpicking, from the absurdity of living under constant surveillance for the pettiest of things. And now, standing by the dam with the cool breeze brushing across my face, I finally felt that freedom. Of course, the story didn't end there entirely, because the videos of Karen's downfall kept circulating online, eventually picked up by local news outlets under headlines like HOA president dethroned by backyard flood, and neighborhood uprising after water fine backfires, and though my name never appeared in the articles, enough people in town knew the truth that I became something of a folk hero in the local hardware store and coffee shop, where strangers would clap me on the shoulder and say, "You're the guy with the dam, right? Good on you." I usually just smiled and shrugged, not seeking fame, but deep down, it felt good to know I had stood up not just for myself, but for everyone who had suffered under Karen's rule. Sometimes justice doesn't come in a courtroom or a boardroom. Sometimes it comes in the form of muddy shoes, soggy roses, and the roar of water reminding a tyrant that she isn't nearly as powerful as she thinks. And as far as I was concerned, that was the best fine I never paid.